This Sunday on Capital Connection, politicians look for answers in the wake of mass shootings, tragedies gripping the nation in Boulder, Colorado and Atlanta, Georgia.
Limit assault weapons.
Senate Democrat Ram Villivalam joins us to explain how his ideas to fix the Foid might reduce violent crimes up to 40% in Illinois.
If we enact common sense gun safety policy that includes background checks, that includes obtaining fingerprinting, the statistics show that gun deaths decreased by 40%.
And Republican State Senator Terri Bryant responds with pushback how she'd like to change the Foid card. You might not expect her answer.
I don't support the Foid card in the first place.
It's all coming up on Capital Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Maxwell is asking the tough questions. This is Capital Connection.
Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell, reporting from the Illinois State Capitol on this Sunday, March 28th. For the second time in as many weeks, the horrific scenes of a mass shooting gripped the nation. This week in Boulder, Colorado, last week in Atlanta, Georgia. These instant flashes of immense tragedy shocking our senses that have largely grown numb or weary under the steady stream of reports of gun murder in neighborhoods that span our state. Now, calls growing louder from elected officials who are looking for answers to prevent the grief and loss of gun violence.
This is not about getting rid of the Second Amendment. It's simply about saying we need reasonable gun safety laws. There is no reason why we have assault weapons on the streets of a civil society. They are weapons of war. They are designed to kill a lot of people quickly. Let us all agree that we need background checks. But the point here is Congress needs to act. If we pass legislation, it's permanent. If the Congress acts, then it becomes law. And that is what we have lacked. That is what has been missing. We need universal background checks.
Unfortunately, we have had mass shootings in Illinois. I very much want to make sure that we're securing our families with proper gun safety legislation. Those are things that the legislature has been working on for some time. There's a lot of discussion that's gone on behind the scenes during my entire term as governor. I think that this will accelerate some of those conversations. We ought to limit assault weapons. We have to define them properly and then limit the ones, particularly ones that are repeating, where you've got bullets that are firing multiples of them in milliseconds or within a second. Those are things that we've got to do away with. Those are for no other use than killing masses of people.
Joining us now is Senator Ram Villivalam, Democrat from Chicago. It's good to have you with us. I want to first get your reaction to the news. What happened in Colorado with this most recent mass shooting? What did you see when those headlines flashed across the screen?
It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. We have somehow figured out how to manage this pandemic in the last 12 months and make sure people are preventing the contraction of COVID. Yet we have not taken action yet on how we can address mass tragedies. It's not just Colorado. What happened in Atlanta, what happened in Chicago, what happened in East St. Louis, what happened just recently to Senator Sims in Springfield. These mass tragedies, these gun violence issues, we need to address them.
You referenced Senator Sims. We hope to hear from him soon. A gun was drawn while he was here in Springfield. That person in custody. Fortunately, no one was hurt there, just to fill our audience in on that. When you made a comment earlier this week, and I think right now you have some legislation, there's some in the House as well, that would fix the Foid is sort of the rallying cry here, the firearm owner's identification card. But you said earlier this week that if the state were to expand background checks and implement fingerprinting or monitoring of people who have a Foid or want a Foid, that it could reduce violent crimes or gun murders by 40%, I think you said. That's a big number. How would that work? What would happen if we did those two things? Is there anything else? How do you know that it would get us to that 40% reduction in gun murders?
Absolutely. Well, the data does not lie. And what we've seen according to the research is that if we implement fingerprinting, if we do background checks, if we ensure that there's a strong licensing system in our state and make sure that the Illinois State Police have the resources they need to remove illegal guns from folks that shouldn't have them, we will reduce gun deaths and gun violence by 40%. That is what House Bill 3245 and Senate Bill 568 does. It is fixing the FOID to block illegal gun ownership.
And that includes felons. Who else should be on that list of people who should not have a gun?
Well, that is what the system and the legislation is designed to address. We want to make sure that if you own a FOID card in the state of Illinois, if we're able to obtain your fingerprint, we'll be able to identify who you are and if you should have a gun. We are not in any way trying to take away any rights of responsible gun owners.
I don't mean to ask an overly simplistic question, but isn't that right there in the name, firearm owner's identification card? If that doesn't identify the person, what does the fingerprint do in addition?
Well, the experts from law enforcement and the research that has been done by Johns Hopkins and also the Giffords Law Center shows that fingerprinting is the best way to identify someone and ensure that they should have a FOID card, they should have be able to own a gun.
I'm sure by now you've heard some pushback. There are many gun owners who feel like they are made or subjected to be a bit of a suspect, a preliminary suspect before any crime has occurred, and some chafe at that idea. Perhaps others are open to it. How do you convince gun owners that this is the best approach?
Well, first let me just say this. This legislation and the tenets of this legislation is supported by the majority of the American public. The polling shows, for example...
Well, most states don't have a FOID card. This is a specific thing to Illinois.
Sure. However, what's in this legislation in terms of background checks, for example, is supported by 90% of the American public. So number one, the American public wants to see their legislators take action. Our public safety is our number one responsibility. Number two, this legislation has been worked on by a coalition of stakeholders, coalition of constituents across the state of Illinois, which is why it has support from the Illinois State Police and other law enforcement agencies, and also has support from criminal justice advocates and faith and healthcare leaders in between. And so I would say that the broad coalition of support signifies that this has been a well thought out, based on data legislation. And again, we are trying to make the FOID card system work better. And that means, for example, when you do the fingerprinting, the Illinois State Police is able to process those FOID cards faster and move along that process for people that, quite honestly, are responsible gun owners that should not have to wait.
Mm-hmm. When we look back over the data over the last several years, from 1993 to 2013, over that 20-year span, gun murders were drastically cut in half. You mentioned trying to do that by 40%. We've seen that happen before. What do we learn from that? Do we know what caused that reduction in violent crime?
Well, I'll say that while that is a good item that happened, the reality is we still have a long way to go. What happened in Atlanta, what happened in Boulder, what happened in Chicago, what happened in East St. Louis and Springfield last week illustrates that we still need to take action. The time to act is now, and that's why we need this legislation that not only addresses obtaining fingerprinting, background checks, it enables the Illinois State Police to do their jobs better, but also, let me just say this, it provides funding for communities that have most been affected by gun violence in terms of mental health, in terms of life-saving initiatives. And so I think that strategy, the four tenets I just laid out, looks to address not only ensuring that these mass tragedies don't happen again, but also that we reduce gun violence, everyday gun violence overall.
It does get a little bit muddy when you start to consider the ongoing, I don't want to say smaller scale, but the mass shootings are sort of one aberration or one type of violent crime, and you have the other, which is just this ongoing plague of whether it's poverty or desperation or crimes happening in certain pockets. It's hard to, it doesn't seem like there's a one-size-fits-all approach to fixing all of these different iterations of violence. I don't know how you might address that.
I would say that, I would say that the legislation takes both into account, both the mass tragedies and the everyday gun violence. You look at some of my colleagues, and by the way, this legislation has the support of 20 3 of my Senate Democratic colleagues in the Illinois State Senate. But you look at some of my colleagues, like for example, Leader Jackie Collins. She supports this legislation because it does address some of the everyday gun violence that she sees in her communities on a daily basis, because of the fact that there is funding for mental health and life-saving organizations to do work in that community, because that we're able to do background checks to ensure that people that should not own a firearm should not have one.
We saw a 59% increase in mass shootings in Illinois in 2020. What happened there? What was driving that?
What is driving that is not passing responsible and common sense gun safety policy.
Well, with respect, in 2019, we didn't have those new laws on the books. In 2018 and 2017, and those numbers were sort of going down. They spiked up in 2020. Do you see any correlation to the coronavirus there driving that?
I think we can point to a number of different factors. At the end of the day, I think what constituents in our districts expect us to do is to move common sense gun safety policy forward and ensure that we're keeping them safe. We're keeping our kids safe, we're keeping our community safe. And so we can point to the stresses and the challenges of the last year. At the end of the day though, this is a problem that has been long-standing, and we're trying to find, and I think we have found, a responsible way to address this issue.
All right, I want to switch gears for a quick minute while we have you, because you do chair the Transportation Committee. You mentioned long-standing problems in Illinois. One of them is this perception, or in some cases perhaps a reality, where our viewers may know billions of dollars flows through the Department of Transportation every year. A lot of this goes towards repairing roads or repairing bridges, and sometimes there has been in years past favoritism, or this idea that a politician could phone in a favor to the Department of Transportation or apply a little pressure here to get the project in their district done, and then other less clouded areas of the state might not see that priority or attention to the roads in their district. You have a solution for that? What is it?
I appreciate the question. What our taxpayers deserve and need is transparency and equity. And I'm proud to say that I've worked with Representative Cam Buckner in the House and stakeholders across the state, from the Civic Fed to the Transit Equity Network, to ensure that we move legislation forward that makes it so we're looking at the capital plan, the Rebuild Illinois capital plan, in a performance-based planning way. And I'm proud to say that the Illinois Department of Transportation is working with us to get this done. We need transparency. We also need equity. One statistic that I always point to is 95 out of the top 100 Chicago area region transit commutes, 95 out of the top 100 longest commutes in the Chicago area region are from Black and Latino communities. So what does that mean? That makes it harder for them to get to their job, their hospital, their school, and that's what we need to solve.
Do I understand your bill correctly, that it would basically more or less take the decision-making process or the priority ranking process out of the hands of a bureaucrat or a person and into an algorithm where it would spit out and say, okay, we're going to take a number of factors into consideration here, and then the computer is going to basically tell the Department of Transportation which project to begin first. Is that right?
Well, it's more intended to provide transparency on their process in terms of how they prioritize projects as part of the multi-year plan, and ensure that they obtain public input as part of that. And then also, though, it adds factors like equity and environmental to that equation. And so we believe the Illinois Department of Transportation should be able to do their job and execute the $45 billion Rebuild Illinois capital plan. However, we strongly believe that it needs to be done in a transparent way, and that they need to include these other factors that may be on a spreadsheet or as a bullet point right now, but really need to be prioritized as they put the projects in the multi-year plan.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in who goes first and which projects get done first. I guess one question, under this system, would a lawmaker still be able to lobby effectively the Department of Transportation? Could they still pick up the phone and say, hey, you got to take a look at this?
Well, let me say this. We were elected by, in the Senate, 217,000 people to advocate on their behalf. And so I think there are going to be conversations about those priorities in each person's district. That being said, we have instances right now where there's not even transparency for legislators. One example is there's a colleague of mine who has a project in her district that has been in the out year of the multi-year plan for 22 years. And she has asked repeatedly, when is this project going to be prioritized? And so when I say transparency, I first mean for the taxpayers, then I also mean for people that represent the taxpayers, like us. I know that there's this assumption that we make a call and then the project gets prioritized. That is not even the case. And so I would say that the transparency piece and the equity piece is for all of us, for the taxpayers, for the department, and for legislators to ensure that we know what's happening and how we're getting there.
All right, Senator Ram Villivalam, I think your first time with us on Capitol Connection. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to watching these debates unfold in committee and on the floor of the Senate.
Thank you very much.
We're back in just a moment with Senator Terri Bryant. Stick around.
You're watching Capitol Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Illinois has decriminalized and legalized marijuana. Now its focus could shift to softening criminal penalties on harder drugs. This week, the House Judiciary Criminal Committee adopted a plan to reduce the felony convictions down to just a misdemeanor for certain amounts of LSD, meth, or cocaine, or other hard drugs.
The drug war policies of 1980s just doesn't work. They're disparate. They're racially applied, and in so many cases, all people, should really just have an opportunity to deal with the addiction.
I don't agree these are low levels. This would include things like fentanyl. This would include 40 tabs of LSD. This would include 40 hydrocodone, 40 oxys. So when I think of small amounts, I certainly don't think of those levels.
Prisons, jails do not treat addiction. People just simply cycle in and out of those county jails. The sky is not going to fall because we change this from a felony to a misdemeanor.
I think you're going to see an increase in the use. I think you're going to see more people that are not just regularly using it, but more consistently as an expansion of those folks going into new categories of people to use it. I think you're going to see increase in property crimes.
Republican State Senator Terri Bryant joins us now from Murfreesboro. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
What's your reaction to this idea? Illinois has already decriminalized and legalized marijuana completely. Now the focus is shifting to hard drugs, not going as far as maybe Oregon completely decriminalizing, but taking away that felony conviction, and it would move it down to a misdemeanor. What effect do you think that would have?
Well, first let me just say that they tried this last year. During lame duck, when the criminal justice reform bill was pushed through. During the 2 or 3 days previous to that bill, we had a subject matter hearing when a representative from the ACLU gave testimony, and I asked him on the floor, because I was leading the debate at that time, what drugs were they talking about? And so on the record, we basically got him to say that they were talking about LSD, about methamphetamine, about heroin, and immediately got reactions from constituents at home that said, absolutely do not do this. I think because we exposed it at that time, they took it out of the criminal justice reform bill because they know it's bad to do this. And so now they're just trying to go through a back door to try to get this passed in a different way as a standalone bill. And as I did during lame duck, fought against it, I'm going to continue to fight against it. If you think about it, we have an opioid crisis in this state. Why would we want to open a door for individuals to carry what are not small amounts of those opioids and exacerbate the problem that we have right now with opioids?
I believe the bill as written right now would allow up to 3 grams of cocaine, up to 3 grams of heroin, 40 pills of LSD or of oxy. So those are the amounts. If you had over that, that would be a felony.
Yeah. I asked the question on the floor because crack was a part of what was going on, and I come from the Department of Corrections. Mm-hmm. I have no recollection of anybody who was a cooker, a meth cooker, ever creating that only for their own personal use. So in this case, the bill talks about you having it for your own personal use in small amounts. The drug dealer isn't looking at if this person is going to have small amounts or not. Allowing people to carry small amounts empowers the dealer that's going to be bringing those in larger amounts. I think it's a very bad idea.
I did see some agreement from Republicans and Democrats that we shouldn't, or we should be rethinking as a society this idea of taking people who have drug addiction and just putting them in cages, putting them in prison. That maybe they're not getting the best treatment for an addiction in jail.
Would be awesome if we could find the funding to give them the care that they need when they're on the street. But often that is not the case. I do know that once they are incarcerated, it can be a part of their recovery that they do, that they get the help that they need, whether it's mental health or whether it's drug rehab. And there are specialized programs and specialized facilities within the Department of Corrections that help with that. Obviously, we would rather them get that help on the street. But how does allowing them to carry those illicit drugs help them with that addiction? I don't see the correlation.
There is a program in Taylorville. The local police department there has this safe passage program, and basically the way it works is they say, okay, if we catch you on the street, you've got these drugs, we're sending you to jail. But if you come to us and you hand over your drugs, we'll get you to rehab. So there's the tough love option, if I can say that, and then there's the option where they help facilitate into rehab as well. And I wonder how a program like that would change if the jail option was off the table.
Well, a program like that might work, but that's not what this bill says.
Right, but this bill would actually say jail is no longer an option. It's a misdemeanor.
Right.
And no matter how many times, if you become a repeat offender, it's a misdemeanor on your first time, it's a misdemeanor on your 20th time.
Yeah, that is not productive to society to exacerbate the problem that we already have with drugs, including the ones that we've mentioned, LSD, heroin, cocaine. I wonder about the folks at home if they think that it's okay for an individual to walk around with those amounts of illicit drugs on their person.
Opioid addiction, visits to the ER, overdose, and death are all still going up. Isn't that an indication that the system that we have today, locking people up for these hard drugs, isn't working?
No. I think it's an indication that we're not giving people the help that they need on the street. People make choices, and if they choose to use those drugs, I understand that they have an addiction to it, and we should get them help. And hopefully we could use some of the funds that we have available for incarcerating individuals. We can shift that to the street. But obviously, we would have a continued argument about whether the threat of incarceration helps. I can only tell you from the perspective that I have with 20 years in Department of Corrections, that the inmates themselves say they can't do jail time again, they won't be doing drugs when they get back out on the street again. So I know that other members will talk about data that they have that gives a different perspective. I can tell you what I've heard those who are incarcerated say.
When we look at the state's efforts to reduce this mass incarceration era that we're in, I think over the long run, if this trend continues, we will have at some point cut our prison population from 25, maybe up to 40%, maybe even as great as 50% from where it used to be to where it could go. Yet the budget at the Department of Corrections is going the opposite direction. It's still going up. Is there room there, or is there an obligation, rather, for the Department of Corrections to say, okay, we've got all this money and a declining population of prisoners, should they take that money and repurpose it into more mental health in the prisons, or to change the way that we do that?
I would hope that that's what they would do. Let's try to remember that just a few years ago, the population in the Department of Corrections was at 130% capacity. So originally, the idea of reducing the prison population wasn't just about mass incarceration. It was about the idea that you built prisons that weren't built to house that many people. How can you give programs or help to people when you're at 130% capacity? So I think part of the conversation has to be, have we reduced it to the place where it should have been in the first place? Are we at 100% or below capacity now? Because if we're at 100% capacity or below, that's a good thing. But do you take money away from them now because you were trying to reduce the overcrowding? Or do you take the money that was supposed to be going to that in the first place and use that to help the people who are incarcerated? Because the ones that are going to be left by the time they get done releasing, all of the people that they're releasing right now, are the worst of the worst. And they're the ones that need the help the most, or the ones that should never be back out on the street again.
Illinois has been contemplating these issues of criminal justice and which types of people belong, or which crimes land you in prison and don't for a while now, but there are other implications and ramifications of having a criminal record as well. If we go back to this idea that if you have a certain amount of hard drugs in your possession, now you're no longer a felon. If this bill were to become law, you would have a misdemeanor. Well, one of the ramifications of having a felony is that you can't carry a gun. You can't have a Foid card in Illinois. How do you see that in connection, or is there a correlation there between someone who has 40 pills of LSD or Oxy on them? You could say that person is a mid-level dealer, I think. That's a decent amount of drugs.
So what I would prefer to see is us allow for an appeal process. If somebody has had a felony in the past, what was the felony? What was the level of felony? Was it a Class X? Was it a Class 1? Rather than just say all felonies. How long has it been since the person had a felony? In some cases, maybe you'd want to take a look at the age. I think that we could look at the possibility of having an appeal process rather than just saying the person doesn't get a felony anymore and moves it to a misdemeanor. Wouldn't it be better to look at whether or not you could have an appeal if they've had a felony in the past? A felony should be a felony, should be a felony. I don't think we should reduce the level of that charge simply because you want someone to be able to carry a gun later.
I guess the question is, would you have concerns about a person carrying that amount of hard drugs now being allowed to also carry a weapon?
Has the person been rehabilitated? Is the person off the drugs now? You know, how much time has passed? So I would keep going back to that again. I think in an appeal process, you can take a look at the fact of what did the person do that caused them to get that felony conviction. The felony could be something other than drugs. But if in fact the person was addicted, they were convicted of the felony, but now the person has gotten treatment, a significant amount of time has passed, they haven't reoffended, is it possible that that person could then get a Foid card? But let's don't lose sight of the fact that I don't support the Foid card in the first place.
The existence of it?
The existence of it at all.
Why not?
I believe that it's your Second Amendment right to own a firearm.
The Second Amendment and the Supreme Court has said in D.C. versus Heller that there can be local regulation on who gets a weapon.
I understand that, but a Foid card issue, especially right now under the current climate, where someone has applied for their Foid card because that's what's required, and 18 months later they still haven't received their Foid card, even though the state police have taken their check and cashed their check. The director of state police has issued a letter that says that their Foid card is still good until I think it's 1 year after the end of the executive order.
And they're asking people to carry that with them as evidence.
Correct.
The letter, right?
But that doesn't mean that the store where you go to buy your ammunition will allow you to use that particular letter. They don't have to acknowledge that if they are an FFL dealer because they're under some federal laws. So the point is
that happening though? Are gun owners denying customers ammunition at the counter?
Yes, they are. They're denying them ammunition, and they are also not processing their firearms purchase within the 72 hours that the law requires.
We know there are ongoing lawsuits at the federal level right now. Illinois Foid card holders are basically saying that this delay, this big backlog, the state says was caused by the coronavirus. The paperwork process that has piled up there amounts to a violation of their Second Amendment rights. We'll see how those cases proceed.
Yeah, I would challenge the governor at this point. It was all hands on deck to do away with past felonies and so forth, right? To allow people to expunge their past records. That got done earlier than was anticipated or required. In this case, there's been no help given to the state police to alleviate the backlog for people who have a Second Amendment constitutional right to own those firearms, who have Foid cards, who are going through the legal process as it sits, and they're waiting 18 months to get those Foid cards.
It sounds like you question the political will or the priority on this issue.
I would question that, and I would question whether or not it's purposeful to continue the backlog.
So you think there might be intent there. I want to bring attention to another bill. Senator Dave Kaler from Peoria has a bill that would sort of combine. So there's this Fix the Foid bill. It's a bigger issue that would expand some of the restrictions and fingerprinting around the Foid card. There's this separate idea that would basically say, hey, if you want to skip that line, or if you don't want to wait in line to get your renewal processed, just give us your fingerprint now, and we'll expedite or fast track your Foid card so that you will be able to just avoid this big backlog, this headache.
Before I answer that, let me just say I'm speaking for Terri Bryant in the 58th Senate District. I don't speak for the whole Republican caucus, but I would just...
Some of your colleagues in the suburbs might have a different view.
They might have a different view than I do. I live in deep southern Illinois, where we take this very serious, right? With the concealed carry applications, you can give your fingerprints, and that is supposed to be expedited because you've given your fingerprint. That isn't happening. So someone has given their fingerprint in the case of CCL, and it's not being expedited. There's nothing happening because you gave your fingerprint. There was no, last year... You're
saying not happening at all? There's no evidence that it works?
Well, it's not being expedited. So just because the person puts their brings their fingerprints in doesn't mean that that person is going to get an expedited look. Or if they're getting an expedited look, they're not getting it. They're not getting their actual CCL in an expedited manner. So many of those are 6 months, 8 months, and I think that it's 8, they're supposed to get it in 8 weeks, I believe.
So it sounds like you're saying if the fingerprint fast track wasn't working for concealed carry, you question whether it would work on a larger scale.
Why would it work when you have a backlog of 18 months with Foid cards now, and there's a smaller amount of people who have CCL license? If it's not working with CCL, why would it work with Foid? And then there were a lot of questions last year when Representative Willis ran this in the House. I was in the House last year, and I led the debate against this as well. Who is going to control those fingerprints? How long are they going to stay on file? There's a million questions.
Where's the victim? Why not give the state your fingerprint? If you have a gun, what's the harm?
Well, I would say that then for voter registration. What's the harm then in having a fingerprint for your voter registration?
So you agree there is no victim there. There's no harm in giving a fingerprint to have a gun.
Well, why would you need a fingerprint to have the gun?
Senator Villivalam, who was on the program a moment ago, said that if they have that, state police support this idea because they believe it could help them more quickly trace those who would use firearms to commit crimes, and that they could reduce violent crime by 40%.
But for those who are otherwise law-abiding citizens who are exercising their Second Amendment right, they're being fingerprinted as if they were a criminal? No, that's not right.
But again, where's the victim? Where's the harm?
The victim is why would a law-abiding citizen have to give their fingerprint? You're treating that person like a criminal for no other reason than the fact that they're trying to exercise their Second Amendment right. So if you're going to use the argument that you're using right now that there's no victim, where is the victim in using fingerprinting for other rights, such as voting, such as getting a driver's license, any other right that an individual has? But this is a constitutional right that you're asking someone to give a fingerprint for.
You can't quite compare the two, though, because you can't use your ballot to kill someone. You can with a gun.
Well, I think you, in a sense, you probably could, because you're being able to vote on who's going to be in these seats. So technically, yeah, you can't pick up a ballot and shoot someone with it, but there's a great amount of power in being able to vote. So I'm just using that as an example. Mm-hmm. We have rights under our Constitution that cannot be infringed upon, and yet you're asking a law-abiding citizen to give their fingerprint, and they've done nothing wrong.
There's a look at some of the debate that may lie on the horizon. We see these moments. I do want to get your reaction, though, to before we let you go, to these mass shootings that we have seen that have gripped the nation's attention these last few weeks. If not expanded background checks, or if not fingerprints, then what? What is the solution to these horrifying moments that we see? Yes, violent crime has dropped over the last 30 years in a broader sense, but I think as a society, we look at these moments, these flashpoints of great pain and tragedy for an entire community, and we think there's got to be a way to stop that. What then? If not those ideas that your colleagues on the Democratic side have proposed, then what?
So the two shootings that you're talking about, one in Colorado and one in Georgia, first of all, those are not Illinois.
They're not, but mass shootings are 59% increased in Illinois in the last year.
Well, they're not, the two shootings that you're talking about, though, were not Illinois.
But Illinois has
And
a
I
problem.
don't know what the law was in Colorado. I don't know what the law was in Georgia. But again, we're talking about people that clearly have mental health issues. We're not talking about law-abiding citizens who have done nothing wrong and changing the laws so that their rights are being infringed upon. I think that's what the conversation has to be on. Do we want to fix the mental health issues? Yes. Do we fix those mental health issues by keeping otherwise law-abiding Illinoisans from being able to exercise their Second Amendment rights?
All right. Thank you for joining us, Senator
Thanks
Bryant.
for having me.
We're back in just a moment. Stick around.
You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
The fight over the future of Illinois' political maps is playing out in a series of hearings, both online and virtually and in person across the state. But there's a hiccup in the process. Usually every 10 years, states rely on data from the U.S. Census Bureau to zero in on where their voters are and to draw the maps in a way that the party in power likes most. But this year, that census data is delayed by about 3 months, due in large part to the coronavirus and all the ways it complicated that bureaucratic process of getting out and counting each resident where they are and finding where people have moved over the last decade. Redistricting experts have scored Illinois' political maps that exist today and found they're not very competitive, but they do go out of their way, more than most states, to compile and preserve the voting power of minority voter populations. There are 4 majority-minority districts in Congress in Illinois where a majority of the population is a minority voter. And that's something the Supreme Court has upheld in past years, that you can't do the opposite, chopping voters up by their racial or ethnic makeup to dilute the power or the voting voices of those groups. That's where we pick up at a redistricting hearing on Monday night in Peoria.
Voting rights is absolutely essential.
Al Hooks is with the NAACP.
This is 10 years worth of representation. It's going to affect our dollars and everything else. So this process is critical.
He says the way politicians divide up voters leads to a more divided country.
I think gerrymandering has probably had the greatest impact on what has happened in our country to date.
Those political divisions were on full display Monday night as Republicans stalled.
There is no need to rush these hearings because the official redistricting data from the Census Bureau has been delayed and it will not be available until this fall.
And Democrats forged ahead.
We don't need a census data to hear about how the community has changed in the last decade.
Democrats plan to use numbers from the American Census Survey instead.
These numbers aren't as accurate as the census.
So in a polarized political climate, how do you define a fair map?
There's a voting rights definition, and that is that you keep ethnic communities and communities of color together so you don't dilute voting strength there.
Can you do that without the full census data?
I think we can.
How can Illinois voters trust a map that doesn't have the full census data?
Well, because we know an awful lot about the data of population movement and so on. Look, it's not the Illinois' fault that the Census Bureau isn't prepared. It was the previous administration and COVID that both played into this problem. We have deadlines to meet, and so there's great data out there to be used. I know the legislature is looking at that data now.
Wait 90 days to get it right for the next decade. What's wrong with waiting?
Well, again, there are sources of data that are being used that are they've been used by the Census Bureau itself. And so I think those are reasonable for the legislature to look at. And again, decisions about that will be made over the next couple of months by the legislature.
This once-in-a-decade political fight could spill over into a legal battle as well. Republicans have already said that if Democrats pass maps that don't use the full census data, or if they don't rely on an independent commission to draw those maps, that they'll challenge them in court. We're back in a moment.
You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
That does it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. You can catch our full extended interviews up on our website. We hope to see you at the same time next Sunday. For Capitol Connection, I'm Mark Maxwell. Stay connected to the Capitol all week. Follow us on Twitter at CapConnectIL or watch reports from our Capitol team on WCIA 3. You can also find us on Facebook or WCIA.com.